A suspension of mercy. (4) About 10 days later, in the first week of June, Alicia finished her portrait of Grace Lillybanks. It was 3/4 length, a 3/4 view of Mrs. Lillybanks just under life size. Mrs. Lillybanks was holding some black and yellow pansies. Alicia had done it in her old style, starting with background first, closing into the face, doing the face in quick strokes once she got there, the last touch of all the light that showed across the irises of Mrs. Lillybanks' strongly blue eyes. Alicia was quite proud of the portrait. Realistic, to be sure, and realism was something to be looked down on, to apologise for among people she knew, people who painted and people who didn't. But it was hardly more realistic than Picasso's famous portrait of Gertrude Stein, which Alicia, and lots of her friends too, considered a masterpiece. "It's better than the one over the fireplace," Sidney said, "so why not put it there?" Alicia had not let him see it until it was completely finished. She had worked in her studio upstairs, where Mrs. Lillybanks had come every morning at 10 to sit for an hour or so. But Alicia's pride in it did not go that far. It was still realistic, and therefore less of a work of art, somehow, than her most inferior abstract. She hung it on a side wall in the living room, removing the abstract that had been there. "Yes, I do like it," Alicia said pensively, gazing at it. "I'll pick up a frame at Abbott's or somewhere." Abbott's was the large, barn-like, second-hand furniture place in Debenham, where the Bartlebys had acquired Sidney's work table, their living room sofa, chest of drawers, and many odds and ends around the house. It's funny not to know somebody for very long and succeed in getting a likeness, isn't it? But I've heard of writers who say that to write about a place they've known all their lives is harder than to write about a place they've known just 3 weeks, because they can't choose the right details about a place they've known so long. True, and Sidney knew exactly what she meant, but the words touched him like a personal, directly aimed criticism. He had been stewing too long over the planners, he knew, and so did Alicia know. He couldn't really see any more details about it, or the whole of it either. Couldn't see it. And yet it was the best bet he had for making money in the near future, so he was sticking with it. They went to Ipswich that evening for a Chinese dinner, then to the cinema, and when they came out, their Hillman had a flat tire. Sidney took off his jacket so as not to soil it, and went to work with a jack and a wrench. Meanwhile, Alicia found a soft drink machine and came back with containers of Sick, making orange pop. Sidney would have liked a bottle of lager after his exertions, but he couldn't have gotten one because it was 11, and the pubs closed at 10:30 p.m. "Isn't it good Mrs. Lillybanks didn't come?" Alicia said. "With this flat? I wouldn't have known what to do with her." "Mm-hmm." They were taking off again after Sidney had left half his container of pop standing up on the curb because he could not see a rubbish can anywhere. Alicia was still sipping hers. They had rung Mrs. Lillybanks around 6 and asked her if she would like to go with them tonight, but she declined, saying she had had a hard day in the garden. "She's got a gardener," Sidney said. "She must be pretty delicate." "Just a part-time gardener, twice a week. Mr. Coxedge from Brandeston." "Coxedge?" Sidney smiled. "What a name. Coxedge or Coxedge?" "Oh, Sidney, I don't know." And Alicia's maiden name was Sneezum. Her whole name sounded like a sneeze, the inhaled suspense of Alicia, the confirmation of Sneezum. Sidney had used to tease her about her name and make them both laugh, using her name to sneeze by when he had to sneeze. "She told me she had a bad heart. She may not live another 2 years," Alicia said in a tone of quiet respect, as if she spoke about a relative. Alicia had become very close to Mrs. Lillybanks during the painting sessions. They had both talked now and then in a quiet, absent way that had been curiously revealing, Alicia thought, and very good for her, at least. She had told Mrs. Lillybanks about Sidney's difficulties with his work, his discouragement just now, and even hinted at her fears their marriage would not last. Mrs. Lillybanks had talked about habit, daily life leading to lasting love, and of the crucial 2nd to 4th year in marriage. Mrs. Lillybanks said she had had something of the same feeling in her marriage, though her husband had been very successful as a naval engineer. "Not so nice for the daily," coming in one afternoon and finding Mrs. Lilybanks dead in her chair," Sidney said. "Oh, Sidney, how awful. What a thing to think about." "It could happen, couldn't it? She's alone most of the time. Why should you think she'd be so obliging as to kick off when the Daily or somebody else is there? She'll probably die in bed like my grandfather. Died in an afternoon nap. Certainly must have been peaceful, because no one in the house knew it until they tried to wake him up." Alicia felt uncomfortable and vaguely annoyed also. "Do we have to keep talking about dying?" "Sorry. I'm a plotter," Sidney said, slowing down to avoid hitting a rabbit that was zigzagging all over the road. The rabbit ran off to the left, up a grassy bank. "I think of a lot of things." Alicia said nothing, not wanting to prolong the conversation. It would happen, of course, probably while she and Sidney were still living in their house. Alicia's eyes filled with tears. Sentimental and dramatic tears, she thought reproachfully. She'd never be able to look at Mrs. Lilybanks again without thinking she might die any minute, and it was thanks to Sidney's unnecessary remarks. "I wish you could put some of your plotting into your work where it belongs," she said. "Some in your novel, for instance." "I'm working on the damned novel. What do you think I'm doing?" "You're working on the back part. Maybe it needs a plot all the way through. If you're going to work on it for a while, why not try putting some plot in all the way through? And why not stick to your painting and let me do the writing?" "All right. But something's the matter with the planners, or it'd sell. Isn't there?" she asked, unable to stop herself now. "Oh, for God's sake," Sidney said, speeding up a little. "Not too fast, Sid. First it's a pep talk about the best of novels getting kicked around for years, then it's something's the matter with it, or it'd sell. What am I supposed to believe? Or are you just trying to be nasty tonight?" "Nasty? I'm throwing out a suggestion about plotting. You say you're so full of plotting, off paper." It hit home, and Sidney smiled with a grim appreciation. "Yes," he said, emphatically. "Yes, and sometimes he plotted the murders, the robbery, the blackmail of people he and Alicia knew, though the people themselves knew nothing about it. Alex had died 5 times at least, in Sidney's imagination. Alicia, 20 times. She had died in a burning car, in a wrecked car, in the woods, throttled by person or persons unknown. Died falling down the stairs at home. Drowned in her bath. Died falling out the upstairs window while trying to rescue a bird in the eaves drain. Died from poisoning that would leave no trace. But the best way, for him, was her dying by a blow in the house, and he removed her somewhere in the car, buried her somewhere, then told everyone that she had gone away for a few days, maybe to Brighton, maybe to London. Then Alicia wouldn't come back. The police wouldn't be able to find her. Sidney would admit to the police, to everyone, that their marriage hadn't been perfect lately, and that perhaps Alicia had wanted to run away from him and change her name, maybe even go to France on a false passport. But the last was sort of wild. France involving complications not in character with Alicia. "Sidney!" "What?" "You went right past the house?" Sidney braked and turned around. Mrs. Lilybank's house was a dark lump in the milky light of the half-moon, but to Sidney it did not seem blind. It seemed to be staring intently at their car as he drove it up the short driveway and into the shelter of their wooden garage. He'd have to plan his murder of Alicia more carefully, and be far more cautious about removing the body because of Mrs. Lilybank's nearness, Sidney thought automatically, and as impersonally as if he were thinking about the actions of a character in a story. Then, in due time, he would get Alicia's income, which would be nice. He would silence her voice permanently, that voice forever sabotaging him. Sidney thought of his rewards in a detached manner too. Freedom and a little more money, as if they were coming to someone else. Sidney's and Alex's joint Nicky Campbell effort, Mark of the Killer, the tattoo story, was turned down by the third and last possible buyer with a note saying, "It isn't bad, but it's been done before." The tired, terse rejection churned in Sidney's brain for days. He took aimless walks along roads, always wanting to find some woods, to walk into the fields. Yet he found no woods, and the fields, deserted as they were, looked to him as if they belonged to some watchful farmer who would ask his business if he set foot in them. Well, what was his business? Nothing. That would sound more suspicious than anything, Sidney supposed. Better to have an answer like, "I'm interested in rabbits, and I thought I saw one disappear down a hole here." He finally did venture into a few fields, but was never challenged. He would walk for miles, slowly, not thinking of food until he became hungry, which was always after 2:30 p.m. when the pubs were closed and he could get nothing. Then sometimes he would find a small grocery store and buy a package of Kraft's sliced cheddar and an apple. It was out of anger and a sense of irony that his idea for the whip came. When it came, Sidney turned and began to walk quickly toward home, thinking as he went. The whip would be a criminal character who did something ghastly in every episode, and this wouldn't be a serial, but something that could go on, a complete story in every program. The audience saw everything through the whip's eyes, did everything with him, finally plugged for him through thick and thin and hoped the police would fail, which they always did. He wouldn't carry a whip or anything like that, but the nickname would be suggestive of depraved and secret habits. Might have a cigarette lighter with a whip design on it, whip cufflinks, S-shaped. His first exploit might be a robbery. The robbery of a plush house belonging to some moneybags with whom the audience wouldn't be in sympathy anyway. The police wouldn't know his real name, but they suspect he is one of 3 known criminals whose dossiers they have. The whip is none of them. He has no police record, because he has always been too clever for the police. And he started young, of course. No, that couldn't be conveyed, because the whip had no intimates with whom he talked. That would be part of the fascination. The audience wouldn't know what was on the whip's mind until he started doing things. Satisfy the public's appetite for corn, takeoff, and violence beyond control of the law, all in one. Sidney's thoughts collapsed and vanished suddenly. He smiled and looked up at the blue but sunless sky. He had decided that the disposal of Alicia's body required a rug, which he would be carrying over his shoulder, with the apparent intention of taking it to the cleaners, for instance, which meant he'd have to get one because he couldn't leave the floor of the living room or one bedroom naked. But his sensibilities balked at asking Alicia to come with him to choose one, and he thought of going to Abbott's by himself and bringing one home on his own. He'd say he was tired of looking at the threadbare thing on the living room floor, which he was. Sidney's mind went back to the whip again. Near the house, he began trotting, and once in the house, he went straight to his typewriter. He put a carbon in the machine because he wanted to send a copy to Alex. Then he wrote, "The whip strikes." The whip. No one knows his real name. Even his bills come to his London flat addressed to 6 different people. He is 35, suave, slender. Brown-haired, brown moustache, no distinguishing marks except those of a gentleman. Belongs to an exclusive club in Albemarle Street. Speaks French, German, Italian. He detests police, and his gorge rises at the sight of any bobby, though the whip has never killed one. He simply outwits and defies them. He has no partner, no confidant, though many in the underworld and upper world are willing to cooperate with him because A, he has helped them in the past, or B, he pays well for favors. These will be hour-long shows, each complete in itself. As our first story opens, the whip is getting low in funds, as we see from his scanning of bills in his chic Mews flat in St. John's Wood. An amused smile plays over his face. His face is eloquent, but not hammy, and the whip never stoops to soliloquies by way of making his intentions clear. The whip acts. He goes out and hails a taxi, asks the driver to drive him through certain moneyed neighborhoods. His manner is relaxed as he cases these spots, making a note now and then in a small Moroccan notebook. Driver chats with him. He has no destination, but says he is looking at places where he used to live. Tells driver he has been in India for the past 15 years. It dawns slowly on the audience that he is putting on an act of being an elderly man. He has aged 30 years since getting into the taxi. The whip dismisses the driver, and we have the feeling the driver would not be able to identify him if his life depended on it. The whip walks 2 streets, gazes at house he intends to burgle. He has the man's name in his little book, Right Honourable Dingleby Haight, Q.C. Fade out. Fade in on a mid-morning scene at tradesman's entrance of the Haight mansion. The whip is now nearly unrecognisable in the guise of a plumber, and is quite amusing to look at. The butler at the Haight house insists that they didn't send for a plumber, and the whip insists just as firmly that they did. His workman's accent is impeccable. The whip is admitted, and is shown to the bathroom on first floor. Whip observes maid in Milady's boudoir. No matter, his kit contains chloroform, and his first victim is the butler, whom he conks with a spanner as the butler leaves bathroom. Maid comes to investigate reason for butler's slight outcry, and the whip steps from behind bathroom door with ready handkerchief full of chloroform, which he claps over maid's face. Maid swoons to ground. The whip then takes his large kit, empty except for chloroform, and, my, you're going great guns this afternoon, a brainstorm. Alicia stood in the doorway with a large bowl of strawberries. Yep, Sidney said over his shoulder, annoyed at being interrupted, but not as annoyed as usual. Sorry I crashed in, but your door wasn't shut, and Mrs. Lilybanks just brought these over. Isn't that sweet of her? She got them in Fram. Want some now or wait till dinner? Sidney stood up and smiled politely. He looked straight at Alicia, though he really didn't see her. Even his eyes were still focused for the distance of the typewriter page. Save them for after dinner. For me, anyway. Okay, darling. Sorry I bothered you. Sidney worked until dinner time, read his synopsis over, then took it to the post office in Roncinol, whence it wouldn't get off till early tomorrow morning, but he wanted it in the post tonight. This was Tuesday, and Alex would get it in the early post Thursday. Sidney was pleased. The whip had been taken by surprise by a man delivering wine, but had knocked him out on the way to the wine cellar. Then, amused by 3 prostrate forms in the flat, the whip had decided to make the robbery look like the work of a gang, and had soiled several glasses with beer and scotch, though without leaving fingerprints, and wadded a few linen napkins up on the kitchen table. Coolly he had walked out the front door with his bulging kit, entered a tube station, finally arrived at his own house. He had telephoned his fence, who came that evening, finding the whip in dinner clothes, displaying his loot, which presumably had come from someone else, and driving a good bargain. The whip received a sizable sum, and the stolen jewellery and silver left the house via the fence. "Another Nicky Campbell?" Alicia asked. "No, something else," Sidney answered. He was making the salad rather hurriedly, as dinner was almost ready, and it was soufflé tonight. Eggs were only 1 in 6 a dozen now in the country. "A new character? What kind?" "Well, just for luck, or superstition, maybe I shouldn't talk about it. It's so new. Born this afternoon at 3 o'clock. "A serial?" "No, thank God. Complete episodes." "A crook, this time," he started to say, but maybe it was bad luck to say even that much. "Anyway, Alex ought to be able to write the first story from what I sent him." Then back again to the planners, Sidney thought, which was going to have a plot now. He'd never had much respect for plot, mainly because he thought in real life people were more separate than connected, and the connection of 3 or more people in a novel was an artifice of the author who ruled out the rest of the world because it did not contribute. His first 2 books, however, had a bit of a plot, he had to admit. Monkey's Choice, his first, had gone into paperbacks, and he still occasionally got a royalty, like $4.19 from hardcover sales, as the book was only 4 years old. It was about his experiences in the merchant marine and involved some of the men he had met in the crew. But that was the kind of book one couldn't repeat. His second, Shell Game, had to do with 3 married couples in Manhattan, all young, all jockeying for position in the discount house where they worked, and for one another's wife or husband. When Sidney was in the middle of writing Shell Game, he had been invited to a party in Sutton Place. There had been 6 or 7 people at the party who might have been called celebrities, a television actor, an actress, a bestseller writer, a Broadway producer, and Alicia Sneesham, who Sidney had liked from the moment he saw her. He had asked her if she were free for dinner and the theatre in the following week, but she wasn't. She was here for such a short time, etc. It had been a brush-off, and also a snub. Sidney had retreated to a corner for a few minutes, trying to think what to do, and had come up with something that he thought would both impress her and secure her company for at least one more evening. A party of celebrities. He would go up to each of the important people at the party and say, "Excuse me, are you free for cocktails at my house next Wednesday at 7? So-and-so," naming someone like Mary Martin or Leonard Bernstein or Greta Garbo, "will be coming, and she or he would like very much to see you, I know, because he or she told me so. So-and-so is coming too." The last named would be a celebrity at the party. Then by telephone or letter he would actually invite Mary Martin, Leonard Bernstein and Greta Garbo, and hope. Then he would invite Alicia, and drop a few names of the people who were also invited. He almost dared carry out his plan, but not quite. He used the idea later as an incident in The Planners, a young man with one bold stroke building a circle of important acquaintances, none of whom ever got onto his scheme because his social life rolled merrily on from there. However, that evening he did pluck up his courage and approach Alicia again, this time with the tritest of ideas: a boat ride around Manhattan Island. This proposal might have reassured her as to his honourable intentions, since it had to take place in daylight among hundreds of people, or the tourism may have had some appeal to her, or his persistence might have tipped the scales. Anyway, she accepted. Sidney feigned illness and took an afternoon off from his job in a discount house. From then on, Alicia was his, Sidney felt, though he took nothing for granted about her and played everything very coolly for fear of losing her through a misstep. They were simply in love with each other. He did not try to start an affair with her. He proposed just before Alicia was to go back to England. Alicia accepted, but said they had to wait much longer, maybe 3 months, and that her parents would have to find out all about him, and perhaps her father in England would want to meet him. Sidney had confessed that he hadn't much money and that his ambition was to be a writer. He felt sure enough of himself to say that, and he was correct, because Alicia wanted to be a painter, or at least try to be. She said she had an income of £50 a month. Sidney met her mother, Mrs. Clarissa Sneesham, and her American-based aunt, Mrs. Pembroke, of East 80th Street, where Alicia and her mother were staying. Alicia arranged to stay on another month, while her mother went back to Kent, and this period was taken up with planning where they would live, in England, and how, and with Alicia's answering her father's questions by letter about Sidney. Finally came the parental consent, though Alicia had said she would marry him no matter what attitude her parents took. Her parents were not enthusiastic, Sidney knew. He felt he had just scraped by. Sidney and Alicia had decided to look for a house in the country, rather than live in London. Both liked the country and thought it would be better for writing and painting. On the honeymoon, Sidney continued to work on Shell Game, and when it was bought in America, but not in England, Sidney had felt rather established. Alicia praised him, and so did her friends. But the advance had been only $1,500, less agent's commission, and there had been only about $300 in royalties after that, and no paperback edition. Sidney had started on The Planners in the glow of Shell Game's acceptance. He felt that The Planners declined in spirit as his own spirits declined, when Shell Game didn't go into a second edition or sell to paperbacks. It was a kind of human comedy, with the planning of desirable experiences taking the place of Balzacian money-grubbing and social climbing. The 6 characters made bets with each other, and the ones who threw in the sponge, abandoned their plans, had to pay a forfeit to the others. Some were total failures. Some succeeded. One man wanted to become a doctor, and did, at 50. An unpromising but determined woman shed her husband and nearly grown family and married the man she really loved. Another man, attaining what he had wanted, died of melancholia. On an afternoon when he went to Framlingham for white enamel paint, Sidney drove by Abbott's in Debenham and bought a carpet. It cost £8, 4 times as much as they paid for the threadbare red and blue one, but it was in much better condition, and its colours were dark red and dark brown, still just as good with the curtains. Sidney carried the rolled carpet in and laid it at one side of the living room. Alicia was evidently in her room painting, or perhaps visiting Mrs. Lilybanks. An hour later, when he was working, Sidney heard Alicia's voice downstairs. "What's this?" Sidney slid his chair back and stood up. "Bought a new rug for us," he yelled into the hall. "Let's see it. Where? Debenham?" "Yep." Sidney came downstairs. "Only £3. He helped her to unroll it. "Why, it's very nice. I didn't know you took an interest in carpets, darling, whether they're falling apart or not." Sidney smiled, but made no comment. They pushed back and lifted the furniture until the rug was in place. It touched the front and back walls, but they agreed it would be that much cosier in winter, and winter drafts were certainly something to contend with. Sidney rolled the old rug up and started outdoors with it. "It'll get damp in the tool house, Sid," Alicia said. "Or were you thinking of the garage?" "I'll park it in the guest room." The guest room had a rug, but he could leave the old one rolled somewhere out of the way. "We might sell it. Trade it in or something," Alicia said. "You think they give us 10 bob for it, Abbott?" Sidney said as he climbed the stairs. In the next week, Sidney received Alex's first draft of The Whip Strikes. He went into his room and read it eagerly. From the first page, he felt it was incomparably better than anything he and Alex had done before. But Alex had written on his cover note merely, "Sid, dear boy, see what you think of this. Not so sure we need the exchange with stranger in Act 2, 4th scene, page 71. Alex." Sidney thought the exchange with stranger was great, adding a little humour to the suspense. He had no suggestions for Alex except to cut some of the conversation of the whip and the cab driver at the beginning. As usual, Alex had done a good job on his side characters, people Sidney had not even written into the synopsis. Alex had a Dickensian gift for minor characters. Sidney had an impulse to ring Alex and tell him how much he liked it. No use being gushy. Just send it back ordinary post and say he liked it very much and go ahead with the final typing after the cutting. After all, the script was no better than scripts ought to be. It was just that he and Alex weren't in the habit of writing them so good. 5. Sidney's euphoria over the Whip script enabled him to lose a day in Ipswich more or less cheerfully, getting the car serviced. He spent a couple of hours in the library, browsing in the stacks downstairs and then upstairs in the reference department. He took out some books on his 30-shilling-a-year card, then walked through the business and shopping part of town, gazing into windows with the indiscriminate curiosity of a sailor ashore after a long voyage. A pair of brass-rimmed binoculars in a junk shop window caught his eye. They looked as if they had seen service with Montgomery in Africa, or maybe with Rommel. Their black leather was worn and showed brown scuff marks between the brass-framed lenses. The strap was worn also, but looked still trustworthy. Sidney was tempted. The price was less than that for a bottle of gin. But did he need binoculars? Not really. The car was waiting when he arrived at the garage at 3:30, the time they had told him to arrive, and Sidney, as usual, had the feeling the car had been ready long before. He felt in a good mood as he drove home. Tonight, after dinner, he would polish another few pages of the planners for typing up, then watch a suspense play at 9:10 on television. "Letter for you in the living room," Alicia said when he came in. "From Alex, I think." Sidney left the groceries in the kitchen for Alicia to unpack and went to get his letter. It was in one of Alex's little buff envelopes. There was a letter from Barlock in it, besides Alex's letter. The Barlock letter was a rejection of The Whip Strikes, which had been sent back to Alex. "Dear Mr. Polk Faraday, I have read The Whip Strikes with interest, more at the beginning than at the end, alas, because I'm afraid it declines to what we already have too much of. Crime, plain crime, unrelieved by any hero sleuth with whom the audience can identify." Sidney muttered a curse at Barlock, then read Alex's letter. Alex's reactions were violently derogatory of Mr. Barlock's brain and other things, and he went on, "Too much crime? The TV men are turning out miles of film of good-looking heroes dabbling at catching crooks with one hand and fondling their girls with the other. We hardly see any crooks anymore. I suggest we tell Barlock to boil his balls and send this off to Plummer at Granada. Unless I get a ring from you tomorrow Thursday, I'll do this in late Thursday post. Alex." "Well?" Alicia said from the doorway. "It's another rejection." He tossed the 2 letters down on the telephone table. "The hell with them all," he said quietly. "Well, it's only one person. Barlock, isn't it? What did he say?" "Stuff that doesn't make any sense." Sidney was talking calmly, but he twisted up the brown envelope until it was a tight, stiff length like a twig. "Can I see it?" "If you want to." Sidney left the room, went upstairs, but near his study door he found he couldn't go into his typewriter, didn't want to see his table or his chair. He turned around in the hallway, wishing he were anywhere but where he was. He wandered downstairs again and out into the garden, caught a snail, a hobnidod, Rutledge the handyman called it, on the lettuce, and hurled it far across the road. He wandered about in slow strides, not doing anything constructive, though he noticed half a dozen things he might have done: pull a weed, put the hoe back in the tool house before the next rain, straighten a tomato stake. He paused and looked straight at Mrs. Lilybank's house with an air of defiance, but he didn't see her outside or in. He'd had the feeling she was looking at him. At dinner, Alicia said, "I read that rejection. Maybe he's right, and it is old hat. I sometimes think Alex has a cramping effect on you, on your imagination." "It's I who think up the plots, dear," Sydney replied, on guard against a coming dig from her. "But he knows how to write a television play once he's got the plot." "But the fact the synopsis is going to him may be cramping you. I think you should go more on your own imagination. You act afraid of it." He felt as if she were poking at a raw wound deep within him. She wanted him to try something on his own and fall flat on his face, Sydney thought. It would hurt worse than a joint failure. "You take it all much too seriously anyway. You're not in my shoes," he interrupted. "You're not trying to make a go of anything because you don't give a damn. You just go on painting with your little finger like Mrs. Lilybank's." Alicia's eyes widened, with anger, not surprise. All that bitterness. My. How could you create anything saleable? It's impossible. It's certainly impossible with your heckling. Heckling? Would you really like to see me heckle? She laughed. "I'd like to see you dare." She said more softly, "This isn't the night to have a meal with you, is it? You might keep your temper while we're eating anyway." But neither of them was eating now. "Just like Mrs. Lilybank's sweetness and light," Sydney said. "But I'm at the beginning of my life, not the end." "You're at the end of your creative life if you keep this up." "Who are you to tell me?" Alicia got up. "Whatever you say about Mrs. Lilybanks, she's better company than you, and if you don't mind, I'll spend the rest of the evening with her." "Go ahead." She took a jacket from the clothes hook by the door, glanced into the mirror there to see if her face looked all right, then the front door closed. Sydney had no heart for any work on the planners that evening, which made him feel more depressed, as he knew the work would have to be done at some time. He watched television, then went to bed with one of the books he had taken from the Ipswich library. Alicia came in just after 10. "I think I'm going to Brighton tomorrow," she said, not looking at him. "Mm-hmm. For how long?" "Several days." She began to undress, taking her pyjamas out of the room to the bathroom, though she usually undressed in the bedroom. There was nothing else to ask her about Brighton, so Sydney asked nothing more. It meant driving her to Ipswich tomorrow morning, unless she preferred to take the train at Campsie Ash, a bit closer home. "I'm sorry, Sid, but when you get in these moods they go on for days, and I find them unproductive and not at all fun." "I don't blame you, and I hope you have a nice time. Brighton, is it?" "Brighton or London." She didn't want him to know which it was, so he wasn't going to pin her down. The next morning he did the breakfast dishes, so he did not see what kind of clothes she packed into her navy blue zippered suitcase. By 11:15 he was back at the house, alone. She had left from Campsie Ash, just outside Wickham Market. The day was rainy and miserable, and Sydney plunged back to work on the planners. At 2 p.m. the drizzling rain became heavier, with thunderclaps. Mrs. Lilybanks telephoned. "Hello, Sydney." She now first named them both, though Sydney could not get out of the habit of calling her Mrs. Lilybanks. "I wonder if Alicia's forgotten her clothes on the line." "Oh, I'll get them in. Thanks." Sydney hung up and ran out for the clothes, half a dozen dish towels and 2 of Alicia's cotton blouses on the square, revolving tree. He dashed in the back door with them and had just removed his raincoat when the telephone rang again. It was again Mrs. Lilybanks. "I wanted to say a word to Alicia, if I may, Sydney." "I'm sorry, she's not here. I'm not quite sure where she is." "What do you mean?" "I drove her to Campsie Ash this morning. For the train. I think she's going to Brighton. I thought she might have mentioned it to you last night." "No." "Occasionally she, likes to get away for a while by herself." "Yes. Well, it's not important. I only wanted to tell her she didn't need to bring over that wildflower book this afternoon since it's raining so hard." Sydney knew which book she meant, an old Victorian flower album with coloured drawings made by some Victorian miss, which Alicia had picked up in a London bookshop. I'll tell her you called."
"When will she be back?"
"I think in 3 or 4 days."
"Well, if you get lonely, do come over," Mrs. Lillibanks said. "Any time."
Sidney thanked her and said he would. That evening, a little after 6, when the rates became cheaper for trunk calls, Sidney rang Inez and Carpi in London. There were 2 girls who shared a house together, and each had a baby about a year old. Inez was a Negro girl from New York, Carpi a Jamaican of nearly white skin, and they both were dancers, though since the babies they had retired from their London dance group. Their husbands were always away in New York or the West Indies, or had been since Sidney and Alicia had known them, which was more than a year. And at last it had dawned on Sidney that the girls had no husbands. Alicia thought Sidney was probably right, so he had stopped asking the girls anything about their husbands. Certainly the babies looked no more than half what the girls were, the rest of them white. Inez and Carpi were hospitable, bright, and good fun. On one of her runaway trips, Alicia had stayed with them, as they had a 3-story house in a mews, but Alicia was not with them now. Sidney spoke to Inez.
"Gosh, well, you're not really worried, are you?" Inez asked.
"Oh, no, if she's not in London, she's in Brighton. It's happened before. Or she could be with the Polk Faradays, I suppose."
"If you want me to, I'll call a couple of places here and call you back. Save you some dough."
Inez was always mindful of economy. "No, thanks, Inez. I'll ring Alex because I want to talk to him about something anyway."
"But she's okay, is she? Not mad or anything?"
"Oh, no, she just gets housebound out here now and then." Then Sidney called the Polk Faradays. Hitty answered.
"Oh, hello, Sid. Alex is having a drink with someone tonight. He's not home yet."
"I hope he's buttering up Plummer. That wouldn't be it, would it?"
"No, it's some new author for Verge Press. I'm sorry about that reject, Sid. I thought that script was super."
"Well, it's down but not out. Yet. What I called up about is, I don't suppose Alicia's there, is she?"
"Here?"
"At your place?"
"No. You mean you don't know where she is?"
"She went off this morning. I thought maybe to London, but it looks like Brighton, because you're the second place I've called in London. Sometimes she likes to get away, and I can't blame her. I'm not the picture of cheer, with one rejection after another."
"Goodness. Did she take the car?"
"No, I put her on the train, for London. I'm not worried, because she's done it a couple of times before, you know." Hitty knew she'd done it a couple of times before, but he could almost hear Hitty's brain clicking over, thinking Alicia wasn't a good wife to desert her husband just when he was discouraged.
"If you don't hear from her by tomorrow, do let us know, would you, Sid?"
"Thanks, Hitty. I will." 6. Mrs. Lillibanks rang the next day and asked if Sidney would come for dinner.
"The mobile butcher had a special treat today, fresh Dover sole, so I bought 2, hoping you could join me."
"Thanks, I'd like to. What can I contribute, and what time would you like me?"
"Is 7:30 too early? If you're working hard, we'll make it later."
7:30's fine.
"And don't bring anything, just yourself."
But Sidney took the car to Framlingham and bought a bottle of white wine. He had worked well that day and was in a good mood. So was Mrs. Lillibanks, for the same reason. She was pleased with her painting, and she said so. Her work in progress was upstairs, so Sidney did not see it or ask to. But Sidney kept his good spirits to himself, pretending a slight loneliness and anxiety because his wife was not at home. They ate in Mrs. Lillibanks' half-sunken dining room. 2 corners of the room were filled with tall, polished sideboards, and along the waist-high shelf on one wall stood Delft plates and bric-a-brac. In her unhurried way, Mrs. Lillibanks served a superb dinner, ending with homemade sponge cake and strawberry sauce. She asked Sidney questions about his writing, not prying questions, but the kind that kept him doing most of the talking and enjoying the sound of his own voice.
"You sound more pleased about the whip than your other things," she said as they were having coffee.
"Maybe because it's the latest," Sidney said. "Some more wine?" Mrs. Lillibanks had not finished her glass.
"No, thank you, but do have some. It's delicious. Just made the sole."
Sidney took only an inch more, which left a glass or 2 for a meal for Mrs. Lillibanks. "I expect Alicia will be back by Monday or Tuesday."
"Oh, good. She's probably enjoying some exhibitions in London and just being by herself for a while."
"I now don't think she's in London. Sidney said somewhat awkwardly. "I've called a few of our friends there. I think she went to Brighton. She's fond of Brighton."
"Has she friends there?"
"No, at least not that I know of. No, she'd have mentioned them." Sidney frowned slightly and looked at his coffee cup. He would be saying the same things, he thought, if Alicia were dead now. If he had killed her Friday morning instead of putting her on the train at Campsie Ash. Mrs. Lilybanks would be saying the same things too. The words were coming from both of them like lines in a play they were performing.
"Artists need to be by themselves now and then,"
Mrs. Lilybanks said kindly. "Yes." He glanced at her, grateful. "I suppose I'll have a postcard Monday, or a telephone call." It sounded gloomy. It was only Saturday evening, and Alicia never wrote a postcard on these excursions, at least not to him. "I'll use these days to get some work done too. I mean, assuming Alicia's making sketches for new paintings in Brighton," he added, feeling a blush come in his face. He shifted back in his chair. "More work on the planners, you know."
"Well, suppose we leave all this and listen to some music. There's a concert on the BBC tonight that starts in 5 minutes.
"If we've got 5 minutes," Sidney said cheerfully, bouncing up too, "I'll help you clear away." He insisted over Mrs. Lilybank's brief protest, and in a trice they had the table clear and the dishes ready for washing in the kitchen. Then they listened to a concert of Bach and Hindemith, while Mrs. Lilybanks embroidered a pillowcase for her daughter. As he was leaving, Sidney said, "I'm going to Ipswich Monday, if you'd like to go. Just a little shopping trip."
"No, thank you, not this time. I seem to be pretty well supplied at the moment," Mrs. Lilybanks said.
And Sidney was secretly relieved, because he wasn't really going to Ipswich, not unless Alicia called and asked him to meet her there. But he hadn't been able to think of any other kindness he might do Mrs. Lilybanks. When he had gone, Mrs. Lilybanks put on an apron and did the dishes, then left the pots and pans in the sink to soak overnight. The dishes, she felt, were enough exertion for the evening, and she would be up tomorrow before Mrs. Hawkins arrived and would have all the pans washed and put away. She never left dishes for Mrs. Hawkins because she felt there was so much else to do. She'd enjoyed her evening with Sidney, and she thought he had too, but her pleasant train of thought kept hitting the snag of his anxiety over Alicia. All wasn't well there, Mrs. Lilybanks could see easily. She remembered what Alicia had said, that she wasn't sure she wanted to have a child with Sidney, though maybe she ought to go ahead and have one. That wasn't the right way to have a child, Mrs. Lilybanks thought. Yet who was she to prophesy? Alicia must have gone away a little piqued, or she'd have told Sidney where she was and when to expect her back. Mrs. Lilybanks recalled Sidney's sudden bitter anger the evening she had gone for dinner and met the Polk Faradays. "Christ, is that the 6th or the 10th?" Sidney had said, when Alicia dropped a glass, and his tone had been shockingly fierce. And then Alicia at the table, talking about Sidney's muse not living with them any more, or some such thing. That hadn't been nice either, and Mrs. Lilybanks had seen Sidney's resentment growing in his embarrassed face. Best to be neighbourly to both and not meddle, she warned herself. Later, in her nightdress and her red woolen dressing-gown, Mrs. Lilybanks took a last look at her new painting before she went to bed. It was a yellow vase of white roses and pale lavender clematis, and though it had dash, it did not look as good now as it had at 5 o'clock when she stopped work. Or as good, Mrs. Lilybanks thought with resignation, as it would have looked had she spent her life painting instead of her Sundays. Art, as they said, was long, and the life so short. 7. Alicia sat tensely in a tea-room in Brighton called the Eclair, having a pot of tea and a Sally Lunn. It was 11 a.m. Sunday. She was waiting for Edward Tilbury, who was due at any moment. On Friday, after reaching Liverpool station, Alicia had taken a taxi to Victoria and bought her ticket for Brighton. But she had decided to take a later train, there were trains every hour, and enjoy a little shopping in the West End. She had checked her suitcase and caught a bus to Piccadilly, and had browsed for a while in Fortnum and Mason's, her mother's favourite store. Ah, the good old days, Alicia thought, when she and her mother had gone on shopping trips to Fortnum's, never thinking of money, buying what pleased them, finally having tea and divine pastry in the busy tea-room of the store. her mother feeling exhausted yet virtuous with her afternoon, which had been 2 or 3 hours of the most wanton self-indulgence. Now Alicia bought herself only a box of 6 handkerchiefs with a 4-leaf clover embroidered in green at their corners for 16 and 6. Then, coming out of Fortnum's, she had run into a man she had met at Inez's and Carpe's last party. She hadn't been sure of his name, but he had said, lifting his hat, "Oh, hello, it's Alicia. Edward Tilbury." He was about 30, slender and brown-haired with brown eyes. He was wearing a beautiful suit, and she remembered that he had been wearing another beautiful suit the night she met him. She also remembered that he had said he was a lawyer. He had flirted with her very boldly at the party, and had asked her if she were free for dinner the next evening. And when Alicia had answered with a smile that she was going to be back in Suffolk with her husband, Edward had showed the most charming embarrassment and had apologised. Of course, Alicia had led him on a little too. It had been after one of her and Sidney's more ghastly quarrels, and Sidney had stayed across the room all evening. "Shopping?" Alicia had asked. "Yes, I don't have to. Something for my kitchen. I'd gladly put it off. If you're free for lunch." It was 1:10. They lunched at Overton's because Alicia said she had an errand to do near Victoria. Over lunch, which went extremely well because they found so many things in common, like a love of the seaside, Brack and Antonioni, Alicia confessed that she was off to Brighton for a few days just to get away from domestic routine. "If you're going to be there Sunday, I'd love to come down and join you for the afternoon," Edward said, "if you're free." Alicia had been just a little startled, but after all it was only for the afternoon. "Yes, that sounds lovely, but I don't know where I'm going to be. I'd better meet you at the station." "But I'd drive down." So Alicia proposed their meeting at the Eclair, the first place that came to her mind except the lobbies of a few large hotels where she would not be stopping. Her heart took a somersault as Edward walked through the pink curtained door. He looked nervous before he saw her, then he started toward her with a smile. They spent a glorious day, lunching at the Angus Steakhouse, strolling along the Downs, driving to the Plough Inn in Pycombe for a cosy tea, then lolling in chairs in the late sun on the beach. Edward was sweet and good-natured, such a relief after Sidney. He didn't mention Sidney, and neither did Alicia. She had been afraid Edward would, that he'd naturally suspect a bad quarrel. It gave Edward full marks, in Alicia's book, that he didn't try to pump a thing out of her. "Have you seen Inez and Carpe lately?" Alicia asked. "No, not since the party." Edward turned his eyes to her for an instant, smiling. He was driving, then. "I don't know them very well." Alicia felt relieved at that. She didn't want their mutual friends in London to know Edward had come down to Brighton to see her. No doubt Edward realised that too. She sensed that he could be most discreet if he had to be. As far as Alicia knew, she and Edward had no friends in common except Inez and Carpe, and they seemed to be only acquaintances. They were always having people they scarcely knew to their parties. Edward was certainly more you and better mannered than most of their guests. Edward's fast driving was the only thing about him that made her uneasy, though she could tell he was a good driver. A fear of speed was one of her neuroses. Speed and airplanes. She simply couldn't fly without getting into a state of terror, so she hadn't attempted to take a plane since her last nightmarish flight to Paris when she was 20. They had a dinner even more delicious than their lunch. It was wonderful to eat anything, anywhere, and not worry about the bill. Edward started off a little before 10 p.m. for London, and Alicia was genuinely sorry to see him go.